History portrays Jane Seymour as a meek, pious and simple young woman at the mercy of the powerful men around her who plotted to place her on the throne. Jane is often regarded as the epitome of a Tudor woman and the antithesis of Anne Boleyn. While it is true that Jane was regarded as obedient, religious and warm, there is an often overlooked side of her that was ambitious, clever and strong. In this video we will explore Jane Seymour's rise and demise and what ultimately led to her untimely death. Jane Seymour was born around 1508 at Wolfhall Manor in Wiltshire, England, to Sir John Seymour and his wife Marjorie Wentworth. Her family were descendants of King Edward III, and Jane was fifth cousin to Henry VIII. As a noble girl, Jane was educated extensively in household management and was gifted at needlework. Her academic education, however, was poor, and although she wasn't illiterate, her skills were vastly inferior to her future predecessors. As with many women of her time, little is recorded about her early life. However, it is clear that she was raised quietly and with the expectation and training to make a good marriage. Jane came from a large family, and it was anticipated that she would bear many children. In around 1529, aged about 21, Jane became a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. In 1533, her position carried over to the new Queen Anne Boleyn. During this time there was little record of Jane until she caught the king's attention either at court in 1534 or the king's visit to Wolfhall in 1535. The exact date is unclear, but in 1535 Henry sent love letters to Jane and begged her to become his mistress. Some historians argue that his interest in Jane indicated marital problems. However, this is based on assumption rather than fact. Anne fell pregnant in the early autumn of 1535 and hoped to deliver a son the following summer. Furthermore, it is important to understand that Henry had gone to great lengths to annul his marriage to Catherine by denouncing the Pope and damaging his political ties in Europe, notably with Catherine's nephew, the Spanish Emperor Charles V. Charles refused to acknowledge Henry's marriage to Anne. Henry, a man of pride and power, would not have wanted to annul another marriage and emasculate and humiliate himself in the eyes of patriarchal Europe. His interest in Jane perhaps coincided with Anne's pregnancy, as in the 16th century, intercourse during pregnancy was considered dangerous. Although women were expected to remain faithful, men were not. Henry had at least 4 mistresses during his marriage to Catherine and fathered at least one illegitimate child. Despite his professed love for Anne, Henry was determined to be unfaithful. In early 1535, Henry had a 6-month affair with one of the Shelton sisters. Based on evidence, it was most likely Mary. No pregnancy occurred, and she was given no great fortune or status from the affair. Therefore, it is important to understand that Henry's interest in other women was not a sign of displeasure. It was an unpleasant but ordinary part of his behaviour. Despite pressure from the king, Jane adamantly refused to become Henry's mistress. Jane, a devout young noblewoman with an impeccable reputation, had a lot to lose if she became a royal mistress and Henry failed to secure her future. Additionally, the Seymour family was established at court, and once they realised Henry's interest in Jane, they likely advised her to guard her reputation and hold out for a better opportunity. Times had changed in regard to royal marriages, and it was no longer unheard of for an English king to divorce his queen for another. Nevertheless, if Henry lost interest, her family would secure her a good marriage. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon passed away. Henry and Anne celebrated. No longer could their marriage be deemed bigamous, and there was nobody to contest Anne's right to rule. Their shared excitement indicates that both parties were eager for their marriage to continue at this stage. However, their joy wouldn't last, as days later Anne suffered the stillbirth of a male child. Henry is quoted as saying, "I see God will not give me male children." Anne was under enormous pressure to deliver the son Henry needed. The lack of a legitimate son was one of the major reasons why Henry set aside Catherine. He argued that the lack of male children indicated God's displeasure and that his marriage to Catherine was incestuous, and she had first been his brother's wife. The unwelcome birth of a daughter, followed by 2 miscarriages, did not offer proof that his marriage to Anne was legitimate. It has been argued that their losses combined with Anne's nature tired the king. So far she had failed to produce the son he wanted, and his interest in other women was evident. However, despite their difficulties, there is no factual evidence that Henry intended to set her aside, or that he sought a new queen. This is assumed rather than proven. Shortly after the miscarriage, Anne became aware of her husband's interest in Jane Seymour. Anne confronted Jane when she found out that Jane wore a picture of Henry around her neck, a gift given to her by Henry. During Anne's courtship with Henry, he had given her a similar picture. It is clear that at this stage, Jane had begun to accept Henry's gifts. Anne's outrage highlights her respect for her marriage and how much she valued faithfulness. Despite her hesitance in the early years of Henry's courtship, Anne had grown to love her husband, and her dislike of his affairs was well known. Jane was well aware of the distress Henry's affairs caused to Anne, and despite their confrontation, continued to see him. Jane may not have been sexually intimate with Henry during their courtship, but it is clear that emotional infidelity occurred, and that Jane did not request to be removed from court or discourage his interest. Instead, she remained at court and continued to serve Anne until she usurped her. If Anne is guilty of sedition and usurping, then Jane is too. There is no official record of what Jane thought of Anne, however it is clear that she had little, if any, respect for her. Although Jane refused to become Henry's mistress, she now accepted his once rejected gifts and wore one of them brazenly about court while she continued to serve his wife. Furthermore, she remained at court throughout the affair and Anne's execution. Anne and Jane were never friends, and their religious values strongly contrasted. As a Catholic, it is likely that Jane shared the same disdain for reform as many others of her faith, both in England and abroad, but it is hard to imagine that Jane, who was universally regarded as kind, would have wanted a terrible fate to befall Anne. However, it's possible that she hoped for a Catholic queen on the throne, and Henry's persistent interest in the same way he had shown Anne made her a possible candidate to coax him back to Catholicism. Anne is often portrayed as a cunning enchantress capable of toppling a queen and seducing the king into marriage, and Jane as a helpless girl victimised by her family and forced onto the throne. In many ways, Anne was the antithesis of Jane. Confident, extroverted, sophisticated, passionate, and well-educated. Anne stood out from the moment she arrived at court with her French fashion and sophistication. Anne learned about reform on the continent and discussed her views with the king. Later, the rumour that Anne had become the king's mistress damaged her reputation for the rest of her life. Her marriage to Henry took many years to secure and came at great political and religious cost. Anne's motto as queen was, "the most happy," and her relationship with Henry was considered happy but at times tumultuous, and resulted in one daughter. Additionally, her relationship with Princess Mary was tempestuous at best, and she had no desire to see Mary at court, or tolerate her refusal to acknowledge her as queen. In contrast, Jane was genuinely quiet, modest, submissive, and pious. She remained Catholic post-reform, and her family, although wealthy and connected, were not as powerful as the Boleyns. What Jane lacked in academic education, she more than made up for in household management and artistry. Jane perfectly fit the social expectations of a woman of her time, and considered it her duty to serve her family and her husband. As such, her motto as queen was, "bound to serve and obey," which paints a stark contrast to Anne's expression of joy. As queen, she maintained a strict household and an immaculate reputation throughout her reign. Gone were Anne Boleyn's festivities and socialisation, replaced by Jane's simplicity and order. She was well liked by her contemporaries, domestic and foreign, and is reported to have been a wonderful queen. In contrast to Anne, Jane formed a close bond with the Princess Mary and garnered her respect. Jane knew when to be quiet, but also when to exercise her authority. Furthermore, although she wasn't beautiful, her fair skin and fair hair matched the English beauty standards of her time. Jane was unable to influence the king on political or religious matters, but ultimately she produced a male heir, was the wife Henry claimed to love the most, and was the wife he chose to be buried nearby. However, the similarities between Jane and Anne are often overlooked. Both women were born into ambitious noble families who sought advancement at court. Marital alliance was the most common way to advance family legacies or secure ties to the crown. Noble girls were raised to make good marriages. What's more, women were the property of their fathers and later their husbands, and ultimately neither Anne nor Jane had much say in their marriages. Although neither were raised to become royal brides, both were eager to serve at court during the 1520s and advance their position and that of their families. They understood the future and consequences of a damaged reputation and successfully strengthened the king's affections while holding out for marriage. It is important to understand that, like Jane, Anne had a clean reputation until Henry's advances became too strong. Anne attempted to evade Henry for quite some time before she either developed affection for Henry or her family pressured her into it. Perhaps, like Jane, it was both. Furthermore, neither woman was considered beautiful for their time, but were able to catch and hold Henry's attention with their personal qualities. Anne and Jane served Catherine of Aragon, and both continued to serve their respective queens until they replaced them. Despite Jane's reported good relationship with Catherine, it did not deter her from court as it had other ladies when Catherine was set aside, nor did she decline to serve Anne Boleyn. Moreover, it is worth noting that both had a flair for drama. When Henry sent Jane a gift of gold sovereigns, she reportedly flung herself to the floor and said she was a gentlewoman of fair and honourable lineage without reproach, and she had nothing in the world but her honour, which for 1,000 deaths she would not wound. Jane refused the gift and said, if the king deigned to make her a present of money, she prayed it might be when she made an honourable marriage. Later both accepted gifts, attention, and letters from Henry, and whether by choice or order, carried out their duties as queen without complaint. Therefore, if Anne was an ambitious seductress, Jane was too. Likewise, if Jane was a victim, then Anne was too. Jane had every reason to play into the power games of court. By her late 20s, she was yet to make a good marriage. Although the likelihood of a royal marriage was low, Jane understood that if Henry could set aside Catherine for Anne, he may set aside Anne for another. Historians have argued that Henry, initially attracted to Anne's charisma and passion, had tired of her tempestuous nature and sought comfort in the arms of the meek and simple Jane. It's worth considering the often underestimated allure of the throne, especially in the context of the 16th century. To become queen would make one the most important and wealthiest woman in the country and an international figure. What's more, queens were gifted extensive lands which generated income, beautiful clothing, jewels, luxury goods, and food. Sometimes queens were able to influence politics or were entrusted with regency. Furthermore, they were waited on every moment of the day. Needless to say, some would do anything for such a position. By 1536, Anne had little support, and there were plenty of people eager for Henry to annul his marriage. Unhappy with Henry's reforms, some quietly hoped that a Catholic queen might influence Henry to revert England to Catholicism and heal his ties with Europe and Rome. It's clear from Jane's years spent at court and her service to two queens that she desired the opportunities court offered. What's more, if Jane was among those hoping for a replacement, she would have understood that her excellent reputation, lineage, demeanour, and religion made her a good candidate to replace Anne. Although it was unlikely Henry would set aside Anne, it had once seemed impossible for a king to set aside his queen for another. If Henry lost interest, her family would secure her a husband. To Jane, it was a matter of waiting and playing along. On the 2nd of May, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where she was imprisoned on charges of adultery, incest, treason, and witchcraft. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her brother George, and on the 15th of May, she was convicted of high treason. She and all 5 men were executed several days later. Anne's downfall was swift, brutal, and unexpected. Where many expected Henry to annul his marriage and take a new wife, few, including Anne, expected him to go through with her execution. Anne's arrest had happened swiftly and with little warning or evidence. On the 20th of May, one day after Anne's execution, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. It is hard to believe that Jane wouldn't have been frightened, even if she believed her marriage to be legitimate and favourable in the eyes of God. After all, her marriage to Henry had come about in similar fashion to her now headless predecessor. Jane, perhaps wisely, left no trace of her opinion. Whether she had any reservations at this point is unknown, but ultimately, even if she had cold feet, she would have to do as her family and king ordered. On the 30th of May, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony. Jane, aged about 27, was acutely aware of the pressure to please Henry, avoid scandal, and produce a male heir. However, unlike Anne, Jane's reputation remained immaculate, and there was no question of the legitimacy of her marriage. By all accounts, Jane was a kind, gentle queen who ran an orderly, quiet household free of Anne Boleyn's festivities and dancing. Jane's reserved and dutiful demeanour was a genuine aspect of her personality. As queen, she drew little attention to herself and tended carefully to her diplomatic duties. On the surface, she was not regarded as beautiful, charismatic, or clever, but those who met with Jane, including foreign officials, regarded her as gentle and warm-hearted. Furthermore, she was favoured at court and by the general public, partly due to the belief that she may be able to influence Henry's Catholicism. Jane is often underestimated as a submissive, weak victim without the intelligence to think for herself. In reality, there is evidence that Jane was more complex. That year, she successfully reunited Henry with his eldest daughter, Princess Mary, although Mary had to concede to Henry's demands. Henry had once been a loving father but destroyed their relationship in the wake of his annulment to Catherine and the demands of Anne Boleyn. This is evidence of Jane's strong diplomacy skills, as Mary was steadfast in her refusal to acknowledge his former marriage or her own illegitimacy, since Henry exiled her mother. What's more, Jane formed a close relationship with Mary, and wanted Mary to be reinstalled at court and to the succession behind any children she expected to have with Henry. Unfortunately, her attempts were unsuccessful, but were greatly appreciated by the abandoned princess. Furthermore, Jane's conversational skills were advanced enough to capture Henry's attention, and while she wasn't academic, she wasn't silent during their months together and was engaging enough on a personal level to maintain Henry's interest. Furthermore, it was reported that Jane avoided conversations about religion or politics and steered clear of anything scandalous. No doubt this was part of Jane's nature, but she was also well aware of the dangers of court and the fate of her predecessors. Although she wasn't raised to become a queen, Jane swiftly acquired the position, understood what was expected of her, and ultimately fulfilled every duty. As queen, Jane was diplomatic, gentle, and strict. Although submissive to her husband, Jane was unafraid to be firm within her household and maintained a strict order and guarded their reputation. It is clear that Jane understood her authority and boundaries, as when she asked Henry to pardon the men involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, and he warned her of the fate of her predecessors, she never contested him again. In late 1536, Jane fell pregnant. She continued her duties and her pregnancy was considered normal. Jane was known to crave quails. On the 9th of October 1537, Jane went into labour. The labour was reported as difficult but uncomplicated and lasted 3 days. Jane gave birth to Prince Edward in the early morning hours of the 12th of October at Hampton Court Palace. There is a myth that Jane Seymour, unable to give birth, was forcibly or by choice given a C-section to save the baby. One source claims that Henry was offered a choice between mother and child and chose the latter. However, there is no evidence that Jane had a C-section. Firstly, C-sections could not safely be performed until the 20th century, and until the late 16th century there are no records of C-sections being performed on live women. If a C-section had been performed, Jane would have died swiftly and horribly. Jane, who was in high spirits, receiving guests and writing letters that evening, could not have had a C-section. Henry, overwhelmed by his son's birth, burst into tears. Bells rang out across the kingdom, and the baby was quickly christened Prince Edward. Jane wasn't to witness to his christening, as she was in recovery and had to be churched before she could return to public duties. The birth of her son finally secured the Tudor succession and cemented the legitimacy of the marriage. At this time, it was reported that Jane was doing well and enjoying somewhat lavish meals. However, their joy wouldn't last, as 4 days after Edward's birth, Jane fell ill. Reports suggest that Jane suffered from lax, which likely indicates food poisoning or intolerance. Jane recovered quickly and continued to make progress until the evening of the 19th of October, when she was struck with another illness. Jane worsened over the weekend, and on Tuesday evening Henry was called. Jane passed away around 2 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of October 1537. The king and kingdom were in mourning. Some historians credit Jane's death to childbed fever. Others have argued it was a postnatal complication. However, there is evidence that another illness may have caused her untimely death. After Jane's death, it was reported in a news bulletin that the fault of them that were about her and suffered her to take great cold and to eat things which the fantasy in her sickness called for. Jane's symptoms such as laxity combined with her overnight recovery suggest the first sickness was food poisoning or some sort of intolerance. Jane was not reported as feverish or as having any unusual symptoms which are expected if she suffered a postnatal infection or complication. However, it is worth noting that Jane, although always fair-skinned, was later reported as rather pale. Unhealthily fair skin is often a symptom of anemia, and it is reported that Jane craved quails during her pregnancy. During pregnancy, it is common to crave the nutrients the body is lacking. Furthermore, quails are a good source of vitamin C and iron. If Jane was anemic during her pregnancy and suffered blood loss, it is possible that it weakened her immune system and left her less able to oxygenate her body. Blood clots are another postnatal risk, and anemia can increase a person's vulnerability to clots. What's more, these clots in a minority of cases travel to the lungs or cause blockages in other parts of the body and result in heart failure. Jane, already weakened from childbirth and a mystery illness, may have succumbed to heart failure as her body struggled for oxygen. Jane was not reported as feverish, bleeding excessively, and no longer suffered laxity. Therefore, it is unlikely that childbed fever killed Jane Seymour. On the 12th of November 1537, Jane Seymour was buried in St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Her chief mourner was the Princess Mary. Mary was followed by 29 mourners. Jane's death was reported to have broken Henry. Jane was remembered as a quiet, graceful, dutiful queen who gave her life to give Henry his son and heir. Henry grieved Jane until the end of his life and chose to be buried near her grave. She is reported to have been the wife he loved the most. In the mid-1540s, when Henry was married to his final wife, Catherine Parr, He commissioned a family portrait with his 3 legitimate children and Queen Jane beside him on the throne. To conclude, Jane Seymour was a kind, meek, pious noblewoman who maintained an impeccable reputation throughout her life and garnered widespread respect. Jane was also clever, quick to learn, and socially competent. She perfectly fit the expectations of a woman of her time. In contrast to her predecessors, she wasn't raised in an academic environment but thrived as queen all the same. Her reign could be compared to the peaceful marriage Henry shared with Catherine of Aragon. Both women were pious, kind-hearted, and domestic. Jane's future was never her own, and whether she wanted to become queen will forever remain a mystery. However, it is clear that Jane enjoyed the opportunities court offered and undertook her duties without complaint. Ultimately, Jane gave her life for her family and to produce Henry's long-desired male heir. Her premature demise cut short all possibility of what her future reign would have looked like. What do you think about Jane Seymour? If she'd lived, would England have returned to Catholicism? Would she live a long and happy life, or would she meet a similar fate to her predecessors? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.